Do you want to lift a Ranger Raptor and not f it up? Let's get into that.
Yeah, I'm overzealous when I'm thinking about the cash flow. I never had no handouts, just came natural. I've been tested so much, all these restless nights, all these different situations that I've been through. I seen pain trying to creep in through the window, but now I'm sliding through the hood in a benzo. You gotta separate yourself just to elevate. I keep some drink in my cup to see through the hate. Sometimes on the road to glory, you gotta press the brakes. I got a lesson plan for all my past mistakes.
Every single day, I see the same question asked over and over again on the Facebook groups. And the advice I always see given is quite often wrong and will lead you to stuff up your car. So let's get into how to set up and lift your Ranger Raptor the right way, God's way. Whether or not it's a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 Ranger Raptor, the process is the same. And yeah, let's talk you through it. Pros and cons and all different methods. Before we talk about lifting the Raptor, we've got to talk about how the shocks work and what makes these different to what we normally encounter in the four-wheel drive space and where people go wrong. Your Ranger Raptor or even F-150 Raptor, any of the Raptors don't run normal suspension struts. On a standard monotube shock, so think your Hilux, your normal Ranger, D-Max, you've got a single monotube piston running through oil, and the piston has shim stacks on top of it, and these shims control the damping purely based on speed. So think of it as the faster the shock moves through the oil, the more resistance you get, the more damping force you get determined by how the shims are stacked. But the key thing with that setup is it's not position sensitive. The shock does not care where it is in the stroke, just how fast it's going. Now the 2018 to 2022 Ranger Raptor changed everything. It runs the Fox 2.0 internal bypass shock absorbers. Inside the shock, you've got bypass ports machined into the inner tube. In the middle of the stroke, oil can bleed past the piston easily so that the ride is soft and controlled. But as the shock compresses deeper, these ports close off. Once they shut, oil is forced through the piston valving and ramps the damping up hard. Now this is how Raptors stay comfortable while they're cruising, but don't smash the bump stops when you hit something fast. And right at the end of the stroke, there's an external foam bump stop at the end of the shaft. So the bump stop's internal to the shock absorber. It's not hydraulic, it's a dense foam that compresses in the last 20 to 30 millimeters of travel. And it softens big hits and prevents metal on metal bottoming. Now the next gen Raptor takes it one step further with the live valve system. So the same internal bypass concept, but it now runs the Fox 2.5 shocks with the live valve system. Now that just means that the compression and damping is actively adjusted in real time by the vehicle's computer using ride height sensors, wheel speed, steering input, throttle and braking. So if the system thinks you're about to land a big jump, it firms up all the shocks right before you hit. And then if you're cruising, it then automatically softens everything back up again. And here's the big takeaway. All of this, bypass ports, bump stop timing, live valve behaviors, it all depends on the shock sitting in just the right part of its stroke. This isn't a Hilux, you can't just crank on preload, throw parts at it and just hope for the best. If your lift does not respect the internal bypass zones and electronic calibration, you don't get a lifted Raptor, you get a stiff, confused and badly behaved mess. Now when people talk about lifting a Ranger Raptor, they're normally talking about one of three methods: spring lifts, Perch collar lifts, or Strut bracer lifts. They all raise ride height, but they all don't do it in the same way. And that difference matters a lot on the Raptor. Now the first method is a spring lift. A spring lift just replaces a factory coil with a longer or stiffer spring. Now this just increases preload, which physically pushes the strut down in the shock body at rest. The result is just the piston now sits lower in its stroke. Now in the Raptor, this just means you have less usable down travel, the bypass ports aren't working in the sweet spot anymore, and the ride gets firmer, especially over small and choppy hits. And despite what people think, a spring lift does nothing for tire clearance at full compression. The shock still travels the same distance, the bump stop still engages at the same spot. So if you're running 35s, that extra tire radius still will go straight into your guards. Now a quick little aside, these are my original springs, and these are lifted springs that I put on when I first got my little PX Raptor, right? I did this the hard way. This is how I know I ruined my car the first time. I did a lot of research, and now this video is just to stop you guys from making the same mistake. Now, Perch collar lifts. A Perch collar lift does basically the same thing, just cheaper. Instead of changing the spring, you'll clamp a collar onto the strut and you force the spring to compress more. You get lift, but it's still the same sort of lift through preload. So all the same problems still apply. The piston's still sitting lower in a stroke, you lose down travel, bypass tuning is compromised, and you get zero improvement in bump clearance. Cheap, yes. Correct, not really. Strut spacer lifts, or puck spacers if you're American. Now this is where things change. A strut spacer lift mounts on top of the strut between the strut hat and the chassis. It lowers the entire strut assembly in the vehicle without touching spring preload and without moving the piston inside the shock. This means that the shock sits in exactly the same part of the stroke as factory. Bypass zones still work properly, the foam bump stop engages exactly where it's designed to, and the ride quality stays plush. And here's the big one, the tyre physically stops lower in the guard at full compression. And now that's real bump clearance. A properly designed strut spacer is the only lift method that preserves factory shock behavior and clears a 35 without chopping travel. That's why, when done correctly, it's the safest and smartest way to lift a Ranger Raptor whilst retaining the factory shocks. If you're putting in aftermarket shocks, you can do what you want, but if you want to keep your Fox shocks, you're best to do it this way. Now, this is where most suspension shops and almost every Facebook comment section gets it wrong. When you go from the factory tyre to the 35-inch tyre, you increase the tyre diameter by about 50 millimeters. That means you've added about 25 millimeters of radius, and at full compression, that tyre now travels 25 millimeters further into the body. Now here's the important part. The factory tyre already goes inside the guard at full bump. Ford designed it that way. So when somebody tells you just add a spring lift, 35s will fit, they're ignoring basic geometry. A spring lift does not change where the shock stops. A perch collar does not change it either. The shock will still compress the same distance, the foam bump stop will still engage at the same shaft depth. So this just means that with bigger tyres, you will hit the guards. A strut spacer changes this relationship between the chassis and the strut. The shock will still use its full stroke, the bump stop still engages normally, but the tyre physically stops lower in the body. Now that's the big difference between raising ride height and actually increasing bump clearance. If a shop can't tell you where your bump stop engages at full compression or how much up travel you've got left, they're not engineering your setup, they're just guessing. And guessing is how you end up with chopped guards, harsh ride, or a Raptor that doesn't work at all off-road. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood parts of lifting a Ranger Raptor, rake. Now this is where looks just start fighting physics. From the factory, the Ranger sits higher in the rear than it does the front. It's not a mistake, and it's not just for load carrying. That rake is functional. It changes how the car brakes, accelerates, and transfers weight. When people talk about leveling a Raptor, what they're normally referring to is just simply throwing 2 inches in the front and leveling the whole look of the truck. Visually, yeah, it actually looks pretty tough, but dynamically, you've actually taken a lot of stability out of the truck. Under throttle, the rear will squat and the front will lift. With the factory rake, the nose down attitude, that lift is controlled. When you remove the rake, the front end will raise too much, the steering will get light, and you lose grip at the front end of the truck. And at speed, off-road, it can feel vague and very floaty. Now on the brakes, rake will increase the weight on the front tyres, which increases the grip where you need it. When you level the truck, you do lose that advantage. The front stays higher than it should, braking distances increase, and the truck feels less planted, particularly in emergency stops and on loose surfaces. It might feel fine in the car park, but once you're on the highway, towing, or in the bush, you'll feel the difference immediately. Now, if you want that level look, my recommendation is simple. Do what I did with mine. Put 2 inches in the front, 1 in the rear. You get that nice level look without compromising the ride. That gives you about 25 millimeters of rake. To the eye, it looks level, but in motion, it does perform correctly. You keep that front end grip under braking, the stability under acceleration, and that overall handling balance that Ford engineered into the platform. And that's the big difference between a truck that looks right and one that actually drives right. There's another misconception that we have to address. Springs aren't for lifting a Ranger Raptor, they're for correcting sag. If you've added weight like a steel bull bar, winch, bash plates, roof rack, canopy, drawers, the factory springs can sag. When that happens, the shock's no longer sitting where Ford intended. And sag, not guessed weight, is the only metric that matters. We don't guess, we measure. On the front, the factory ride height should be 570 millimeters from the hub to the flare. Then on the rear, it should be 620 millimeters hub to flare. Now, if your truck is sitting below those numbers on the front or rear, it has sagged. Simple as that, and that's when we change springs. We select then the correct spring to bring the vehicle back to factory ride height, but not above it. The goal is to return the vehicle to baseline, not stack lift into the spring. Once the truck is back at factory height, then we add lift using a strut spacer. That way, the piston stays in the correct bypass zone, the shock keeps its factory ride quality, the clearance stays predictable, and the suspension travel stays balanced. Springs fix sag, spacers create lift. If you mix up these roles, you compromise the entire suspension system. If you're lifting a next-gen Ranger Raptor, this part is not optional. Any lift, spring, perch collar, or spacer must be followed by a live valve calibration. The next-gen runs ride height sensors on the suspension arms. These sensors constantly tell the vehicle dynamics module where the vehicle is sitting. And the system assumes one thing, that the truck is at factory ride height. And if you lift the truck and don't recalibrate, the sensors lie to the computer. The vehicle dynamic module will now think that you're already long in extension, you're about to land a jump, and the suspension needs to stiffen up. So it does exactly that all the time. The result? A harsh, over-dampened ride, inconsistent shock behavior, and headlights that aim themselves straight into the trees. The fix to this is simple and permanent. Using FORScan, recalibrate the ride height sensors and tell the system, this is now the new neutral position. Once that's done, live valve damping behaves normally again. The ride feels factory, just higher. The headlight leveling will now work correctly. There's no fault codes and no weird behavior. If you change the ride height on a next-gen Raptor, even by 10 millimeters, this calibration is mandatory, no exceptions. Once you start lifting a Ranger Raptor, the next question everyone asks is, do I need upper control arms? The answer depends on which Raptor you're working with. The PX3 has very tight clearance between the factory up control arms and the coil bucket. With a 2-inch lift, especially with strut spacers, at full droop, the stock UCA will physically contact the coil bucket. That contact doesn't just rub, it will actually gouge the arm. And that gouge creates a stress riser, a weak point in a highly loaded component. You'll get visible wear, metal loss, and in some cases, cracks will start to form, particularly on vehicles that are driven hard off-road. For PX3 Raptors, any lift around 2 inches should be paired with an aftermarket set of up control arms. It's not for looks, it's for clearance, strength, and long-term reliability. Now, Ford fixed a lot of this on the next gen. The factory UCAs have better coil clearance and the ball joint angles are a lot more forgiving. In most cases, you can run up to a 2-inch strut spacer lift without immediate interference. But that doesn't mean UCAs are pointless. If you're chasing more droop travel, proper caster after a lift, better alignment range, long-term durability, larger tyres, or more aggressive wheel offsets, aftermarket up control arms are still a smart move. The key signs you need a UCA. If your alignment shop can't get enough caster, if you hear a clunk at full extension, if you see contact at droop, or if you're pushing lift height and tyre size, upper control arms aren't a fashion upgrade, they are a geometry fix. And on a lifted Raptor, geometry is everything. All right, frequently asked questions, rapid fire. All right, before we wrap this up, let's run through some of the most commonly asked questions that I've seen you guys ask in the Facebook groups. Can you just revalve the shocks and make the spring lift work? No, you can't. Revalving will only change the piston shim stack. That is velocity-based damping. It does not change the internal bypass zones because those are actually machined into the shock body. Revalving can tweak the feel, but it will never restore the bypass behavior or fix your tire clearance. Aren't strut spacers illegal? No, they're not. In Australia, suspension mods are governed by VSB 14. All right, this document does not ban strut spacers. However, what it does require is that the modification is structurally sound, does not cause binding, and stays within safe geometry limits. If it's engineered properly and installed correctly, a strut spacer is compliant. I've heard you've had to cut the factory bolts to fit strut spacers. Only if you're using the wrong kit. Generic Ranger spacers don't match the Raptor's strut top, so people start cutting studs and trying to make them fit. That's dodgy. A proper Raptor-specific spacer will use high tensile hardware and bolt straight in. No cutting, no grinding. Won't a spacer lift destroy my CVs and ball joints? Not if it's done properly. CVs and ball joints will fail when you exceed their operating angles, not just because the truck is lifted. If you keep the truck under 40 millimeters of spacer height and with the correct geometry, CV angles will stay well within the safe limits. Failures come from generic kits, excessive lifts, or poor installs, not from a well-designed spacer lift. Can I run springs and spacers together? Yes, you can, but like we went over before, for the right reasons. Springs are for correcting sag from added weight, spacers are for creating the lift. If the truck hasn't sagged, don't stack lift with springs. Fix the sag first, then add the spacer if you want the height. Every problem people seem to blame on spacer lists does seem to come down to one thing: bad design, bad advice, or bad installations. So that's the way you properly lift a Ranger Raptor, the safe way that keeps the Fox suspension working as Ford intended. If you're running 35s, want full travel, and don't want to butcher your ride, strut spacers are the answer. I've tested them on-road, off-road, and in the air. Thank you to Goat Offroad for your help making this video. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments. And if you found this video helpful, hit like, subscribe, and share this with your Raptor mates who are still listening to bad Facebook advice. We'll see you on the next one.